Hello everyone and welcome to the 33rd Annual International Festival of Authors at Harbourfront Centre. My name's James Grainger. I'm going to be the host and moderator today. I'm an author and a books journalist. We're just going to have to do a hopefully not too lengthy preamble just to introduce our five panelists and then also the general topic. First, I just want to reiterate how important it is if all of you could please sign the PEN Canada petition outside for DeWitt Isaak. It may seem like you're not really doing much by just signing a piece of paper, but governments are often very sensitive to international criticism, and there have been a number of cases in which these petitions have directly led to journalists and writers around the world being released from jail. So please sign that on the way out if you can. Also, all of our authors are going to be available to sign books in the Marilyn Brewer book room, which is, you will have seen it just when you came in. So you can get your books signed after the event, and you can also buy copies of their books. So, also, IFOA is a social media friendly festival. So while we remind you to please silence your phones, we invite you to update statuses and to tweet at IFOA using the hashtag #IFOA. So if anybody says something particularly interesting and you want to share it with the world, please do. So now on with the event. Our roundtable discussion today is the topic, a national literature. Is it still relevant in an increasingly globalized multicultural culture? This event, it's the International Festival of Authors in partnership with the Edinburgh International Book Festival and the British Council, and it brings to the stage a unique series from around the world. We're having these types of events all over the world, and this is going to be the Toronto segment. So we want to welcome we also have delegates in the audience who have been on different panels and who will be asking questions or shouting comments or throwing vegetables, I don't know. They'll decide that. And they'll be taking part later when we will be opening up. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to you and to the delegates. So if you have any questions, try to remember them. You'll be able to ask anybody here. So now we're going to hear about our authors. We have Liam Card, A.L. Kennedy, Beatrice MacNeil, Kristen Thornell, and Irvine Welsh. And I'm just going to introduce them, starting from my left. First, we have Liam Card, who I believe is from Port Elgin, Ontario, or that's where you went to high school, so that's where you're from?
Paisley, if we're going to be really specific.
Liam has moved around a lot, as you're about to hear. He studied writing at the University of Ottawa, the University of North Carolina. He returned to Canada and was licensed as an investment advisor. He left the field to pursue a career in writing and acting. His screenplay, Textuality, hit theaters in 2010, starred Jason Lewis, Eric McCormick, Carly Pope, and Card himself. His novel, Exit Papers from Paradise, is about a Michigan plumber who dreams of becoming a surgeon, and it explores the gap between the person we are and the person we desperately want to be, and it does it in a very interesting way. And Liam's appearance tonight is made possible by Dunder and Press. Then we have A.L. Kennedy. She's the author of 6 novels, 2 books of nonfiction, and 5 collections of short stories. Her novel, Day, was the 2007 Costa Book of the Year. She's twice been selected as one of Granta's Best of Young British Novelists. She's won a host of other awards. She's also a part-time lecturer at the University of Warwick. Latest novel, or can I call it a novel?
What do you want to call it?
Oh, no. I just meant it's
Everyone's fragmented. I've only just got here and you're
okay,
insulting
it's called
my
The
book.
Blue Book.
It's a novel, yeah. Good.
It was shortlisted for the Orange Prize for Fiction. It's about a character called Elizabeth Barber, who's crossing the Atlantic on a cruise ship with her boyfriend when she encounters her former partner, with whom she lived a life of deception. She was born in Dundee and currently lives in Glasgow, and her appearance today is made possible by House of Anansi Press. In the middle, we have Beatrice MacNeil, who comes to us from Cape Breton Island. She's the author of the Dartmouth Book Award-winning novels Where White Horses Gallop, Butterflies Dance in the Dark, and The Moonlight Skater. In the children's book, There's a Mouse in the House of Miss Krause. Her latest is The Box of the Dead, which is set in Cape Breton. It centers on Iva Doyle, who's widowed early and runs a boarding house in a home left to her by her doctor husband. And as she approaches old age, she muses over the turns her life has taken. And Beatrice's appearance today is made possible by MacArthur and Company. Fourth, we have Crystal Thornell, who grew up in Sydney, Australia. She's lived in Mexico, Italy, Canada, and the United States, where she currently lives. And tonight she's probably going to be talking about her debut novel, which is called Night Street. It's a historical novel inspired by the life and work of Australian painter Clarice Beckett. She's already received the Australian Vogel Literary Award, the Dobby Literature Award, the FAW Barbara Ramsden Award, and the Sydney Morning Herald's Best Young Novelist Award. Her appearance today is made possible by Goose Lane Editions. Finally, we have Irvine Welsh. He's the author of 7 previous novels, 4 books of short fiction, and he currently lives in Chicago and Miami. His first novel, Train Spotting, has sold over 1 million copies and was adopted as both a play and a film. The film version of his novel, Ecstasy, was released earlier this year. He may or may not be talking about his latest, which is a prequel to Train Spotting. It's called Skag Boys. It begins in the early 80s, charts the journey of Renton, Sick Boy, Spud, and Tommy as they become young men addicted to heroin. Irvine's appearance is made possible by Random House Canada. So just to get started, I thought I would just say a few words that since this is the sort of Canadian leg of this international tour, just a few words. I was going to quote a little bit from this sort of Bible of Canadian nationalism in literature, Survival, by Margaret Atwood. And it's interesting that in the 60s, because Canada was just sort of coming out of its colonial funk, and at the same time was in some ways being culturally colonized by America, there was a very self-conscious movement amongst all of our artists across both English and French Canada to try to define, but also to create a uniquely Canadian literature. And in looking through what had been written by Canadians about Canada before, Margaret Atwood keyed onto this theme about survival, and that Canada, having had such a short history and a history of being in conflict with nature, survival motifs often dominated Canadian literature. And it's very funny. She goes through a list of some of the big Canadian novels that have been written, and she has these great synopses. Brebeuf and his brethren, after crushing ordeals, priests survive briefly and are massacred by Indians. The Stone Angel, old woman hangs on grimly to life and dies at the end. Is it the son Philibert? Hero escapes incredible rural poverty and horrid urban condition, almost makes it financially, dies when he wrecks his car. And my favorite, The Mountain and the Valley, writer who has been unable to write his vision of possibility at the end, but he dies before he can implement it. And one of the great quotes in there that she says is that she was given one of the first anthologies ever of Canadian literature, and she says that these stories felt real to me in a way that Charles Dickens, much as I enjoyed him, never did. One of the things that interests me, and I'm going to start by asking our 2 Canadian panelists, I feel that there's been a movement away from since about the 1990s toward the idea of a national literature, although less and more of an embracing of the idea of a regional literature in Canada. Part of that is because a lot of publishers love novels that are set in 3 different countries because they feel that they have a better chance of selling them into more countries. But also I just think that the idea of a national literature has lost a lot of currency. And so I'm just curious, our 2 Canadian panelists, do you consider yourselves Canadian novelists? Beatrice, especially, do you consider yourself a Cape Breton novelist first?
Yes, indeed.
Really?
And I believe that we are so unique. We may not be always wise, but boy, we're colorful. And the greatest stories come from these people. And I think if they knew my relatives, we'd be all over the world. So.
But why would you say that you think of yourself as a Canadian novelist first?
Well, because I'm Canadian. I'm French and Scottish.
And then Cape Breton second?
Pardon?
But Cape Breton second?
Oh no, we're part of them, you know. We're right there.
What about you, Lee?
On the island.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a Canadian novelist. I was born in Canada, raised in Canada. A lot of the inspiration for any character I create is a Canadian person that I grew up with or was a neighbor. And although I was educated in the U.S., first at the University of Iowa, then finished at UNC in the Carolinas. And in fact, the book I wrote is set in Paradise, Michigan. I would hope that my novel still gets to participate in the conversation of a national literature, because I would hope that the merit of what makes up a national literature was based on quality of storytelling versus where the story's set. And I think that, especially for Canadian authors, I mean, Canadians come from all over the world. We're in Toronto right now, which arguably is the most multicultural city in the world. So I really feel that if, say, a first-generation Canadian Indian family moves to Canada, they're Canadian. And if they want to write a compelling, gripping story about a rickshaw driver in India, then they should participate. That is our national literature. That is our national platform. It's based on quality.
Yeah, and of course, the sense of being between places and being in a new place and looking back at an old place are all very indicative of a Canadian identity right from the beginning, because if you're not native Canadian, someone in your family immigrated here. So.
Trust me, Paradise, Michigan is Port Elgin, Ontario. Okay?
So how come you didn't call it Port Elgin, Ontario? Is that where you were living at the time?
Because I thought it was hilarious that a plumber would live in paradise. and especially a plumber trying to leave paradise. So when I was scouring the map, which took me a whole day trying to set my novel in an interesting place, I knew that I wanted to tell a story about a plumber, and especially a plumber trying to become a surgeon. And then when I scoured the map, I was up near Sault Ste. Marie, and I looked kind of into the U.S., and there was Paradise. I thought, oh my God, I have to set the story in Paradise. This guy's got to be from Paradise, which, interestingly enough, is about 300 miles north of Hell, Michigan. That is a fact. 342 miles.
Would you have thought of writing a novel about a surgeon who wants to become a plumber?
Oh, man.
Who lives in hell?
Who lives where?
Who lives in hell?
Who lives in hell? That's right. Can we co-write that?
So I want to turn the next question over to Irvine and to Alison, being here from Scotland. I'm actually going to quote Irvine's speech from the Edinburgh World Writers' Conference, and talking about, not all of it, just because he did such I think, a great definition from what I would imagine it is like to be a Scottish author. He says, "For we live in a country that isn't a nation, but has been lurching, almost apologetically at times, toward that status, picking up some of the trappings of such an entity en route. But lest we forget, this is still a region of the UK." So I guess I'm just curious in the broadest sense about do you feel that calling yourself a Scottish author, being a Scottish author, has a certain, is actually a political act, whether you intended it to be or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. It's it kind of starts off as a purely sort of descriptive thing to say, but you're aware that you're kind of Scottish and British. You know, you grow up in this kind of this British state, and you grow up with this Scottish identity. And it's like whenever I do kind of tours and sort of talks abroad, if it's British Council sponsored, you can almost see the kind of angst in the sort of typeset in the brochure. You know, should we call them Scottish, or should we call them British, or should we call them UK? And it's a thing that's very, you know, when you get introduced by British Council people, and you know, sort of anything that's kind of slightly governmental or official, there's this tremendous nervousness. This is one of the British, or Scottish, British. So it does kind of it does cause you, it does make you, force you continually to kind of think and assess these kind of terms and what they actually mean.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, again, I've been you always get put out as a party by the British Council to prove that Britain is very diverse. You know, that there's always somebody who isn't white, somebody who's Celtic, somebody who's a proper writer from London, and then you can, yeah, where I now live, and then you the returning party, the people who aren't white always get searched by British Customs just to prove how multicultural we are, even though we're representing the British Council. I get quite nervous about identifying a nation and literature. There's one way around you can do it, which I think is wonderful, and another way which isn't. I think it's wonderful for countries to have a cultural life. And it's unstoppable. It's just going to happen. And I mean, there are certain ways of thinking in the UK that would kind of don't really want Scotland to have a cultural manifestation. And obviously, part of the politics that's moved us towards having a pretend Scottish incredibly corrupt Parliament instead of just the incredibly corrupt Westminster Parliament came from, you know, and we meant well. It came from the arts. When you start having politicians hijacking the arts and saying this is the nation represented in culture, that makes me very nervous, because I think it's so specific. I think an individual person speaks individually, deeply, intimately to, you know, in our case, it's the conversation between the reader and the writer. Mm-hmm. And it's utterly unique, but because it's utterly unique, it's completely universal. And it transcends any kind of nationality. And it can be, yeah, you know, a French-Canadian person writing about an Italian who's moved to Sweden. You know, you can see just from this panel, we all move around, because yes, we're writers, we're alienated, we step back from wherever we are. I mean, you can run up against the ridiculous part of it, which, you know, when I started writing, you'd go down to London and people would say, "What's it like being a Scottish writer?" And you'd go, "What's it like being really patronising?" It's like coming here and saying, you know, "What's it like not being an American writer?" Because there's a default, you know, and we have to have these conversations. You know, you don't get the same conversation about the English novel or the American novel, because they're the default. They're like a proper novel. Yeah. So you don't have the first word. It's just novel.
Yes.
And we have to have these conversations, which for a while, you know, the Scottish writing pulled itself apart, discussing itself. And then suddenly we turned it around. It's just, here we are. And we're not writing to be Scottish in a way that somebody else can understand.
Yes.
And we can have conversations with other people. Because obviously, I mean, Canada, we all fit in because we have the same miserable blood running through our veins, and the joy when it's raining outside, and fish and potatoes and industries that kill us, and other ways to die when we're not involved in industrial accidents and drowning at the fishing, and people who laugh at songs about death and stories about death and films about death. But you know, you can go to Eastern Europe and have those conversations. You know, there's kind of, there are threads running through human experience which are about having a quite dark sense of humour. It's not necessarily a tartan dark sense of humour.
Yeah. And Crystal, just something Alison touched on that everybody, one of the sort of things about our modern world is that people and writers tend to travel around a lot. So I'm curious, that you having lived in a number of different places, we were talking backstage, and you still very much consider yourself an Australian novelist. Do you feel that you lose anything by not being there and writing in different places? And what do you draw? I mean, do you feel like you can bring an authority to writing about Australia because you're from there, or do you think you bring an authority by being an outsider and being in a different place? And then I'm curious to hear if anybody else has anything to say about that too.
I don't think that I feel I have any kind of authority at all in relation to Australianness, actually. I'm always uneasy about what that might consist of and what exactly it is. I do think about it. When you spend a lot of time living abroad, I think you you tend to do that, and you hanker for other places and
Yeah.
and get nostalgic and so on. And then you go back, and sometimes you don't. You know, there's that situation where you feel you belong a little bit everywhere and nowhere.
Yeah.
Which is maybe typical of writers. I think we possibly often feel like freaks or exiles or something along those lines. Having said that, I think maybe I wrote a more Australian-seeming novel living in the States than I might have had I been living in Australia.
Oh, really? Yeah.
That might have been a way to channel nostalgia or to think about Australianness. But I wrote about a painter because I fell for her art, not because I saw her as being an historical Australian figure that I wanted to celebrate because of the national connection.
Yeah. And everyone, I'm curious, now that you live in the States, do you find it any more difficult to write about such a distinct and local Scottish culture that you do write about, and then the language and the way that you write it? Is it harder? Because you're not probably, I guess, not hearing that language in the way that you would if you were back in Scotland?
Yeah, it kind of, I think you have degrees of separation, and I mean, I've lived out of Scotland most of my adult life. I've kind of lived in London or kind of Holland or Dublin, and I kind of feel, I think there is something different about being so far. Basically, you know, it's not you're not a kind of hours Ryanair flight basically from Edinburgh or Glasgow. So it kind of, I think it's. But what I notice is that, you know, that I'm writing stuff that's based in, you know, some stuff I'm doing is based in America, but I'm kind of getting, you know, and I'm researching down in West Virginia, all these characters, but I'm drawing a lot on people back home. Mm-hmm. You know, I think, you know, it's kind of, I think you're kind of, you're always inspired by kind of where you come from,
Yeah.
really, and even if you're not particularly writing about it. I think if I'm going to do another novel based in Scotland soon. I'm going to start it soon, and I think I probably will go home for a bit to do that and to kind of, you know, re-immerse myself into all the sort of nuances of the place. That kind of any place that these kind of sort of currents are always changing very rapidly. It's not kind of set in stone. So I probably would have to be back there, I think, and to get into it.
Beatrice, do you think you could write about Cape Breton the way you do?
Away? No.
If you were away?
No.
Why do you say that?
I have to be around. I have to be around the people. It's like being a surgeon trying to operate on someone when they're 10 rooms away.
Yeah.
I have to be hands-on.
Mm-hmm.
You know. Being a Catholic, we keep close to the flame, you know.
Yeah.
That's.
What about you, Liam? Do you? I mean, where do you? I'm not actually sure where you live right now.
I live 10 minutes from here.
Oh, okay. and
Yeah.
what are you working on now? Where is it set? Do you know yet? Your next project?
I'm working on the screenplay adaptation for this novel, to be totally honest with you. But I did start another novel that's set in Oakville, which is not too far from here. It's kind of the suburbs of Toronto, wealthy, a little more affluent. Not more affluent than downtown per se, but just a nice place to raise a family. Where am I going? What was the question?
Well,
do I have to be in my hometown to write about?
Or do you feel that you're changing as you live somewhere else that's not directly where you came from?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I grew up on a 4-acre farm with a barn and, you know, some horses, and we grow most of our own vegetables. And the first piece of writing that was ever brought out into the world that I ever did was this ultra commercial, slick-looking movie about a guy and a girl trying to get together, but before they can do that, they have to exit the multiple relationships they're juggling on their Blackberries. Nothing from where I grew up really made it in there, except I stole one guy's name who I went to high school with. I didn't even know him that well, but when I was naming this 80-year-old character in the screenplay, it seemed like he should be be awarded this guy's name. But so no, not necessarily. Although this recent novel really was heavily inspired, and I think I'd like to continue to revisit going forward. You know, bringing stories from where I grew up and being inspired by things that happened while I was living at home, because it just seemed to work a little better, I feel, at the end result.
Mm-hmm. And also, I'm curious, just again to the panel, how much do you feel that your work relies on a sort of linguistic, historical, and just the sort of general texture of where you're from?
It's going to depend on the book. I mean, you're building yourself somewhere you live for a while, and
Mm-hmm.
somewhere other people, real people, are going to live, and fake people are going to live. But it might be in another time.
Yes.
Apart from being another country. I mean, it's interesting if things are taken away to see what you need to write, and if you need to, write in a place that's neutral, or if you need to write in a place that's pleasant. And it may be that Cape Breton is, you have to be there because you're writing about Cape Breton. It might be that it's just really nice. I mean, I could write if I was in Cape Breton. Because I travel a lot, most of the books have mainly been written in hotel rooms, which I wouldn't have gone for by choice. But they're undistracting and they have room service, so that's sort of quite good. But I prefer to sit and write normally about Scotland in a cabin in the woods in New York, because it's nice and somebody lets me do that.
Yeah.
But after a while, sometimes the English goes off. But there are lots of variables working on what age you are and where you are and how confident you are with what you're trying to write about,
Mm-hmm.
and how much research physically has to be around you, or if you have to be somewhere for the research, and whether you like being in flight from your own life or corresponding to it quite closely, or you're pissed off with your ex-wife and you want to write about her. People have lots of different motivations, but the national thing is it's just in there with the mix, but it may not be anybody else's idea of Scotland. I mean, in the UK, a guy called Ross Raisin wrote a book called Waterline, which is sort of a wonderful Scottish novel about shipbuilding. And it certainly speaks in our voice that's sort of Scottish, except it's not. It's not a West of Scotland voice that there ever was. He made it up, but it's consistent within itself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's consistent to that industry, definitely. He's English, and I mean, I'd be quite happy. And there's a quote on the back from Alan Warner, another Scottish writer, saying this is a great Scottish book. Because it's it's also an English book, it's also a British book, but why not? He went there and made something that was real within the rules of making things up that aren't real at all.
Mm-hmm. And the rest of you, again.
I was just going to say I agree. I can write anywhere, and I quite like being in flight and being, or in a non-sort of place or a trans space to work, that I get so lost anyway in what I'm doing that a certain amount of isolation and distance can be really useful.
I think the fatal thing is like kids and animals, really, because they don't understand that you're doing something that's very important that involves people who don't exist, and yet you're fond of them and involved, or partners or whatever. And that the intrusion of that, your own little private country, that's horrific, in a lovely way.
So one of the things I just want to touch on, the whole idea of globalism, global culture, and I think if we'd had this panel 10 years ago, there might have been a different range of opinion, but I think certainly in the last 5 years, the idea of globalism is kind of starting to get a bad name. I don't think it's really delivered on its promises of prosperity, peace, democracy. We've got the majority of the world's population are becoming increasingly poor while serving a kind of transnational elite who've turned the economy into a kind of rigged casino. or that's how I see it anyways. And I also have another quote here from Irvine's speech in which he says, "Now the dominant model of internationalism is capitalist and media-led globalization, leveling national and regional differences into a monolith of confused, debt-fueled consumerism and bland disposable culture." So I'm curious, because it's something that I believe, is that a national literature, or even just a literature that's very much steeped in a definitive place, can be a kind of bulwark against that consumerization and commodification of global culture. So I'm interested, Irvine, and all of you, where you obviously, do you feel that you are creating a kind of very human bulwark against something that is not quite human, and which is globalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's very kind of disappointing that sort of, internationalism and the whole kind of post-war idea of internationalism has kind of ended up this way. I think that's a very kind of, I think that's a big kind of dystopian sort of kind of alienated sort of feel that people have about globalization. But I think it's interesting, I think we have to distinguish between, people talk about kind of, a globalized culture or a media culture, and I do it myself, but you have to remember things like, like kind of ballads weren't invented by Simon Cowell, and hip-hop wasn't invented by him either. It's like, hip-hop wasn't invented by iTunes, and the novel wasn't invented by Amazon, basically. All these things come from a certain place. They come from a certain kind of, they come from a nation, a region, a city, a neighbourhood, or whatever. And that's where culture is always formed, and it always takes place. The issue with globalisation now is that as soon as anything becomes interesting and picks up any head of steam, it never gets a chance to grow in the underground and percolate and kind of be strengthened by that. So it's basically pulled into the mainstream, and it's kind of it's sort of synthesized, it's overproduced, it's kind of watered down, and we get it kind of fed back. And obviously sometimes there's things that break through and shake things up and make it more interesting, but it's a lot harder to do this. One of the things that that kind of interested me, and I remember when I started kind of writing and getting some success from writing about sort of 20 years ago, and Alison was saying there was a bunch of us that all broke through. There was a kind of big wave of Scottish writers that broke through, and I think that it was we got a lot of attention, and we got a lot of kind of relative to the writers now, though, we got a lot of kind of national and kind of international attention. I mean, now there's another kind of renaissance of Scottish writing. There's another whole wave of really good Scottish writers, and basically nobody in London knows who they are. Not just kind of internationally. I mean, we were kind of we were featured in the New York Times and stuff like that when we kind when all the Rebel Inc. stuff was kind of happening. Now it'd be almost impossible to think that the New York Times would do a feature on kind of Scottish writers. It's just, and it's in some ways that the kind of cultural mechanisms for that transmission have actually become weakened as market mechanisms for it have become stronger. So what you do get is you get something that's you tend to get something that's easily sold. I mean, for example, like my book Trainspotting was a very successful novel, but now that wouldn't be published by a major UK publishing house. It just wouldn't be. It's just not kind of suitable material for that. So there is the whole problem about globalization is that there's much fewer risks that are taken because we're working towards this kind of common denominator, and that's why the emergence of genre is so strong, because it can people can walk into a store or can click on Amazon, they can see what kind of novel they're buying. It's in this kind of box, and a lot of writers are kind of forced to write into these boxes by that kind of culture, and that's a shame, because of that in a way, it's kind of the market is kind of prescribing and censoring and causing writers to self-censor what they want to do, because people people want to make a living. They've got to eat as well, and if they want to write. And not do other things like kind of teach or kind of ferret around for grants, decrease the number of grants. They really have to kind of build up some kind of readership And it's very, very difficult to do that if you're not getting that kind of exposure. So
Yes.
it's unfortunate for kind of, again, you know, we used to moan about it, but I think it's a lot more difficult for younger writers now.
It's very hard. I mean, I'm doing the reading for the Best of Young British, next Best of Young British Granter list, and you can really see the dead hand of publishing telling young people what to say, which is horrible because, you know, we all meet young writers and there are great books out there which aren't getting published. Mm-hmm. And there are 8 or 9 of the same novel getting published over and over and over and over, which does nobody any good. But I mean, the stuff's still there, or we wouldn't keep having the empty chairs. You know, people writing individual, revolutionary human experience which flies in the face of whatever it happens to be. It was the British Empire, you know, Robert Louis Stevenson was in Samoa saying, actually the British Empire isn't as much fun as you think. Not everybody enjoys having Brown Windsor everywhere on earth, and as has been in the paper, being castrated by amateurs who have pliers. Another one of the fun things we brought to the world. And now it's, you know, it's not under a flag, it's under the flag of money. It's the same. It's the same thing. We're all supposed to like the same things and be the same and have the same voice, and just having a different voice is this monstrously huge revolutionary thing because you're changing the inside of a person forever in an invisible way which might make them do something weird. I mean, that's, you know, it's fundamentally the start of all real change. Is doing something really subversive and quiet and cheap and flexible, like reading a book or having a poem happen to you. That's why people get executed and go to prison and whatever. Yes. But you know, we have to remember that and cling to that and try and encourage it, because, you know, it might not be that you're sitting, you know, as I was being a student in England and reading Alistair Gray and thinking, oh my God, this is places that I've been to. This is not me imagining St. Petersburg. This is, I've been here, I've walked down that street. But it was also, this is really weird. This is as weird as me. I'm not alone in my weirdness. I wasn't really that worried about Scottishness. I was worried about, I'm a freak, but there's another one. And we make lovely things. And it was magic realism, which you know, if not, and I don't write magic realism. I once tried. It was really bad. I don't remember what it meant when I read it now, and it's not clear. But you were saying, you know, magic realism obviously comes from a sense of real issues and revolutionary issues, but you're trying to say the impossible in a context that's horrific. So you go into sort of hyper-reality. But it's this proof of how strong the mind is and how strong the imagination is. And that's the scary thing, is that people are not practicing using their imagination. And if you can't imagine a different government or a different way of being, then you don't get it.
It was interesting that nationalism or that national identity was seen as such a divisive force up until the Second World War, and internationalism was seen as very much a project of the left, and how that's kind of, that one's national identity and regional identity is now subversive to this whole globalizing project that has been taken over. Crystal, did you find that you discovered more of who you were as a person and as an author by reading Australian writing when you were growing up?
Yes, I would have to say I did. Particularly people like Patrick White and Christina Stead. I think they helped me to dream about, not necessarily to have a sense that I was looking into a mirror that showed Australian culture or Australian landscape in some kind of literal, direct way, but that it enabled me to sort of dream my way into the place. Yes. And maybe to think about the uneasiness that a lot of Australians, I think, still have about what being Australian means for all sorts of reasons. Yes, you know, because we're a former colony, because we had a history of doing terrible things to our Indigenous people, because we're sort of in the middle of nowhere. There are all sorts of reasons for being a bit unsure about whether or not we should celebrate or how we should define ourselves.
I think the Canadians in the audience can probably identify with all of those sentiments. What about you, Beatrice? Was there much Cape Breton writing when you first started?
No, I think McLaughlin is probably one of my favorites. And then I discovered Alistair.
Of course, Alistair MacLeod, yes.
Yes, I discovered Alistair, and Alistair MacLeod, I said, I always thought you were a Presbyterian. How did you get it? You're a good Catholic. But I have my own outlet. I do my own PR. I am fortunate enough to live near where the cruise ships come in. So I sell my books all over the world. All over the world. I get them.
One at a time. No.
The highest I sold one day was 49. And I was desperate for the 50th. I almost bought one. That I could have 50.
Helda, we're moving to Cape Breton.
It's amazing. You meet people from everywhere, and you get the most unusual questions. Last week I got asked, "Are there any acorns in Cape Breton?" I said, "Sure, we have squirrels. We have Coke. We have Pepsi. We have moonshine."
But do you have acorns? No, I want to know.
Good almighty. I was quite taken back by it. This was an American.
And Liam, who was the first Canadian author that you really liked?
Wow. Okay, I'm not thinking because it's hard. I'm thinking because they keep getting trumped by recent reads. Maureen Medved's The Tracy Fragments, I loved. Stephen Galloway's The Cellist of Sarajevo.
Oh, I love that too.
I loved so much I went out and optioned. And then I hired Don McKellar, who's currently adapting it into a screenplay. Then I read, finally, I read The Life of Pi. I know, I was late to the party on that one, but, you know, just tremendous. And then I read last year's Giller winner, Half-Blood Blues. So you know, this is a high standard. These are books that set high standards. So the first Canadian author that influenced me, I probably can't remember because I can really only remember the last, 10 that absolutely rocked me. Some of these titles I'm talking about. If I could, I want to backtrack just quickly to this globalization commercial thing because I learned a really important lesson that I want to speak to, and I think young writers, as I was 26. I wanted to sit down and write something, and the first thought that came into my head was, I want to write something that's going to sell. I want to write something that people can relate to. And at the time, I had in my pocket, like most of my fellow Canadians and Americans, a device that was made only a few hours from here, a BlackBerry. So I built my story around something that I thought everybody could relate to, and that was the foundation of how I started my first piece. Well, I'm not sure it turned out, the final product wasn't what I had in mind, and the real point to this aside here is that for my second go-round, which was this novel, I never expected to sell it. I just wanted to write a story that my friends would like.
Mm-hmm. And you're happier with the second one? Yeah, because
That's happy. That's Scottish happy and Canadian happy. That's happy.
But I think that's a huge element of someone's, in a sense, regional identity is your friends. I know that my friends appear in my work. I want to celebrate their little corner of suburban Toronto, and it's sad that I think that so many younger writers, especially who are coming into this marketplace for the first time, are being counseled, I think, unwisely by agents, and not all agents, of course, and all publishing people, but there's a definite vibe in Canada that, like, you have a better chance of being published if you tone that kind of thing down. If the more and more decisions seem to be made by editors, because I think they've lost a lot of their power, what they can sell to marketing departments. And marketing departments see things in the sort of a little bit too much at times as widgets, and not as the fact that, like, you know, who would have thought, for instance, that a book like Life of Pi would have taken off? It just, you know, it's, you know, or, you know, any book that takes off, they're almost always, you know, I mean, a novel like Fight Club. I mean, you know, I read an interview with him, and he said that he sent out his first novel, Chuck Palahniuk sent out his first novel, and it was rejected as being disgusting. And so he wrote Fight Club because he said, no, you don't know what disgusting is. And so,
that book,
and then someone published it, and now,
that book was called Invisible Monsters, and it's spectacular.
Oh, really? Oh, because
Yeah.
I've read
That's that book. It's gross. I mean, it's gory, but it's amazing. I think it's his best book.
That's the terrible thing. I mean, it's supposedly commercial advice, but it's
Yes.
utterly uncommercial, because the one thing you don't want to read is the book that you already read, only a bit of a watered-down version, or the next watered-down version. It's like photocopying something. Eventually, it's just this grey, woolly kind of thing that could be almost anything. And why would you want that? It's like the first writers group I allegedly tutored. This guy kept talking about, you know, we have to be, it's all very well loving what you do, but what you should do is be strictly commercial. I am a writer who has earned money from what I write. And eventually we all, you know, it's supposed to be all lovey-dovey in a writers group, but, you know, the group turned. I was standing back, but they turned. It was like Lord of the Flies. So everybody eventually just said, okay, what the hell did you write that earned money, you witless, tin-eared buffoon? With that last bit being out loud. And he said, the way he'd earned money, which is kind of, again, the equivalent of what you're doing, he wrote golf-related pornography for telephone calls. You would phone up, and if golf was your thing, a lady would talk to you about putters at your own expense. And you kind of think, well, yeah, that is in a way writing for money, and yet it's not a path that any of us wish to go down. But more and more of it now is effectively golf-related pornography rather than effective and lovely soul-lifting fiction.
And I'm just curious, I mean, you're all at different stages in your vocation, I won't say career. Are you feeling pressure about this from your own publishers and from whoever you're working with to conform more to this very broad idea of a global culture and a global marketplace? Do you feel that pressure?
Not anymore. Not anymore.
I mean, even externally, do you feel the pressure?
I've been told that it's good that the book that I'm finishing now is set mainly in the UK, that will be, you know, good for its prospects, which is interesting.
So you're going to set the next one in the Antarctic, just to...
Maybe.
What about you, Evan? Do you ever get that kind of subtle or not so subtle messaging?
No, I mean, I'm lucky because my publishers and editors aren't sophisticated enough to even try that. But, they basically just leave me to do what I like, you know, and then kind of, you know, they have other kind of complaints and moans and all that, but they never really try to sort of suggest what I should write and kind of what I should tackle and what I should not tackle. It's usually kind of, the arguments are usually very kind of prosaic ones about like chapter headlines and stuff like that. And, you've said the same thing in previous books. Yeah, well.
Okay, well, I guess unless someone on the panel wants to ask a question, I thought I might turn it over to our audience and to our delegates and see if you have anything to ask or to add. And because we're being recorded, I will try to repeat your questions so it's on the tape and so that everyone hears it. So try to, I guess, keep it to less than 2,000 words. My memory only goes so far. So do you have any questions? Down in the front?
Yeah, I would like to comment briefly. There is a sentence which I read since when I was a kid in my Christian Catholic teaching, when Paul of Tarsus and Paul says, be a Roman with a Roman, Greek with a Greek, and so on. And then going through school and loving history, I felt that was a supreme wisdom. Actually, I think in a way I would like to to hear if it is some map of what we have been trying to say here tonight. But it doesn't really mean anything, because if I think at the time of Paul, Greece was not Greece, it was a hodgepodge of many little cities and villages and languages. And so was Rome,
Yes.
so was Italy, and so on. So the world has always been that way. And today, for instance, I've been living in Canada 45 years, and now I tell my Italian friend, my English, I love my English. And look at me struggle. What about the Italians? Well, you know, my Italian is good, and they agree. Which one do you love the best? I said, I love them both. They do not accept it, because I have to love Italian more.
Yes.
I said, no, both moves me. And I think if we look at, in that sense, I don't think it's fair to think of a national culture or national language, because there is no national culture, no national language anymore. It was perhaps a dictum of the 1800s that a German had to be a German, an Italian had to be a German, an Italian, so a Briton was a Briton. But today, there is no such a thing. We all who we are. Right?
Yeah, what the gentleman was talking about, the sort of fluidity of a national identity, and that's always been true. There's an excellent historian named Norman Davies who talks about even just the whole idea of the United Kingdom. Never mind Scotland. You have many distinct language groups that throughout history have had different, long vanished kingdoms of like Cumbria and all these different places, and English itself is a Germanic language. So yeah, the idea of a national literature is very even tricky to posit, because nations, the national boundaries are drawn around places. Look at Iraq as a kind of tragic example. Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, said it should have been 3 different countries, because you had 3 such distinct ethnic groups that they should, not to put them in one country. So of course, it's so much of the national identity is based on like who won the last war and who drew the maps.
Yeah, well, but, because it's language and it's imagination, it's even more fluid than history and politics. Sometimes it will go in advance. T. Lawrence is a great example. He had an idea of, which didn't work out, what would happen in the Middle East. And he went out and kind of almost made it take place. But I think the idea of writing is not even be a Roman with a Roman. It's decide that you're a Roman and convince the person who's reading you that they're a Roman. and that's sort of what happens. And you go with it. So I've been able to walk down Nevsky Prospect and think, yeah, I've kind of been here though, because I kind of have, and I was kind of there with a bunch of quality people. I'm not in any way Russian. Yeah. I'm actually from Mesopotamia because I'm a Celt. I had my DNA analysed. I'm a tiny, tiny bit Viking, so goings on must have gone on, and the rest of me. I do like tall blonde men, so it's genetically in me. And the rest of me comes from Mesopotamia via the whole of Europe. And a lot of people who got sunburn and probably quite tetchy as they moved along. So it's not meaningful in that sense at all, really. And we all came from Africa. But when we make stories and we tell each other stories, they're in a particular moment and they're set in a particular real and imagined place. But we make them be home for a while in this kind of act of spiritual generosity, which is very beautiful. But yeah, you don't want somebody to say, I'm going to stick a flag in this now, because you didn't claim it, so we're going to. I said, no, please don't.
Question in the middle there?
One of the flip sides of globalization is that it's increasingly easy to move information around, whether it's a tweet or a picture or a story. Do you think that self-publishing is going to be a way for people to get their stories out and yet avoid these boxes and these silos that, as you say, authors are increasingly being pushed into to sell things?
Yeah, the question is now with kind of electronic media and the ability to move things around so quickly and so much portability, is self-publishing a potential model for authors, creative people to step outside of those boxes that are being imposed on them? Just sort of bypassing the whole global publishing model.
It's not potentially a model.
Well, I mean, do you think it will be
2 out of the top 10 New York Times bestsellers were self-published.
Mm-hmm.
They had just been able to, as you're talking about, harness an audience through Facebook and Twitter, market to that audience themselves, and I mean that's all it really is. I mean, find your audience and market to them, sell to them. If you can do that without having a publisher involved, then I think that's viable for a lot of people, and a lot of people are doing it.
But I think it's always going to be a fairly low percentage, as has always been the case of self-publishing,
Yeah,
that will
agreed.
actually be any good.
Agreed.
I think it's also hard to get. I think that the advantages that publishers, big publishing houses have, is that they can put market muscle behind the book and get into the light. I mean, there's so much stuff on the web that it's very hard to kind of make that discernment. And I think that when people self-publish, they're kind of hoping eventually that it gets that kind of head of steam, and a big publisher will come along and then put the rest of the sort of market muscle into it. Because you don't. I mean, it's like. But one of the things I kind of think, particularly in the United States, what I've noticed is that, and in the UK to some extent, I think it's actually easier to get published now than it's ever been. But what is not easier to do is to actually get books sold. I don't think it's publishing that, whether it's self-publisher or through some a big or small publisher. I don't really think that's the biggest issue. I think the biggest issue for writers is. I mean, publishers take on young writers and they don't promote them in the way that they used to. When I started writing, they kind of basically think, well, we're publishing your book, you should have some kind of web presence, you should have a Facebook page with lots of Facebook friends, or a Twitter page with lots of kind of Twitter people, and you should publicise it through that, and we're not going to take you on tour, we're not going to sort of we're not going to put ads in the press. We're not, we'll send out some review copies, but we're not going to kind of push people to review it. And the pages where it is actually reviewed are shrinking. And you should be sending it out to websites that are quite sympathetic to that kind of stuff, online. So it's basically, we'll publish it, but kind of do it yourself, in terms of all the marketing and promotion. And I think that that's an increasing model, that. Take on a lot, quite a few young writers, and just hope that one of them kind of hits the zeitgeist. It's almost kind of just like a gambling kind of thing. And then it's, after a couple of books they do that, they say, well, maybe it's not just working out here, like, on you go.
Yeah. I was told I should die. That would be a good move.
Some of these books, like.
Unfortunately, somebody on a train, in many ways, unfortunately, got stabbed. That really lucky place where you can get stabbed. If you're going to get stabbed in the head, there's a lucky place. Just went straight between the lobes. The book was called Alison Kennedy, so it was in all the papers. This, really high-profile head stabbing, and the knife, the X-ray with the point of the knife. You can look it up online, Alison Kennedy head stabbing, and you'll see the X-ray. And my publishers were so delighted.
So disappointed when it wasn't you.
Yeah, they really were. The voices the following morning were like, "Oh right, you're not horribly, you're not in hospital. There's nothing wrong with you. Could you pretend you're dead?" It's very, very hard. Yeah, there's no review. Is that like being dead? No.
One thing that I think should be said for citizenship, if it does have some sort of tangible, useful value against this rather bleak backdrop, is that if you don't, especially from the point of view of someone who's only published one book thus far, if you write things that don't sell a lot, being identified, for example, as Australian means that I can live off a grant from the Australia Council, which is huge. So from a financial angle, it is actually something very important. If people couldn't sort of get a handle on me as Australian, I wouldn't be able to write full-time at the moment. I wouldn't be considered for certain awards. So those sorts of things, in a sense, being Australian does keep me afloat, and it makes you visible within a specific community. I think if you're just sort of free-floating in the ether, and I was for a long time. I published little bits and pieces in various places, but it was Australia who sort of made me visible in a way. So having spoken against being put in a box, it does have some value.
Oh yeah, in Canada, the movement toward cultural nationalism has created an entire framework that provides grants to writers and Nancy, who published Survival, they just celebrated their 45th anniversary. You know, and they get grants because they publish Canadian authors, and they can still take chances. I mean, they still, of course, have to sell books, but they can take losses and take chances in a way because of that infrastructure, that cultural infrastructure that was built by cultural nationalism and is maintained by
I remember
taxpayers.
when the Scottish Parliament I was living in Ireland, and they had at the time, they've changed it because of the perilous state of the economy, but they had a kind of tax exemption for writers. Basically all writers and artists in Ireland were kind of exempt from paying any tax at all. And then they introduced a threshold of 250,000 euros. So if you could earn more than 250,000 euros, you would pay tax on anything over and above that, but your first 250,000 euros would be tax-free. And when the SNP kind of took over the Scottish Parliament, I kind of got asked to meet Alex Salmond, the First Minister, and because he wanted to ask me about the scheme. And I said, well, you know, it's like 250,000, and anything more than that, you start paying kind of graded sort of taxation on it. And he goes, we're thinking about letting, this is a very Scottish, we're thinking about letting people have the first 3,000.
Yeah, that's
well, don't expect everybody that's kind of out of Scotland to come rushing back in. In the event, they never even considered that. Like, you know.
And they had, you know, good ways of looking after writers with disabilities, and you know, there's a whole load of stuff going on in Ireland which did them a lot of good, and they've got a much bigger footprint with where they are culturally for their size, which I think is true. I mean, I know you're huge. It took me 4 nights to get across you. Not to be personal, Canada. So you know, but for the size of population, you punch above your weight, definitely. And that's, you know, that again, it's commercially good, and it's good in all kinds of very practical, real world ways, apart from being really, really lovely and excellent and inspiring.
There's a question about the 4th row from the top. Yeah.
As a reader, one of the things I love in writing is discovering other places, you know, Rushdie's India or Tolstoy's Russia, etc. And I was just interested in finding what books you read maybe early on that you found really evocative of other places.
Yeah, the question is which books, I guess we're talking about novels here, short story collections that you found very evocative of a place where you didn't live or hail from.
To mention Alistair Gray again, he was my way into Glasgow. So
That's a good, it's just like that.
echo that.
There are big, scaly underground creatures and people living in cars. It's good. Actually, Sark, the island of Sark, tiny, tiny, tiny island. It's about 4 miles by 1.5 miles, very wiggly. There's a book called Mr. Pie, which is just extraordinary, set on the island of Sark, and I'd always wanted to go to Sark. And then I did, and it was even better than I'd thought, and all of the drawings in it were of Sarkian faces. I mean,
Where is Isle of Sark?
It's in the Channel Islands. It's a tax haven. I think it's so small it's only got 1 millionaire on it, who does those terrible greetings cards that you can personalise. But yeah, that was, I was courting disappointment because I loved the book and I wanted to love an island with no cars and nobody on it, and it was great.
It's funny. I feel that every time I read a novel about somewhere, I want to go to that place. Every time. And if I read a travel piece or a feature, I never ever want to go to it. I want to avoid it.
But there are people who read for emotional reasons, like I do. I don't look for places. Like, I read short stories. It was a discarded book by Isaac Babel. Knock you off your feet. You know, he was, the Cossacks, I think, sort of did away with him. Read Toni Morrison. I don't want to go to Lorraine, Ohio. But it's the emotional impact that these people.
Places can be emotional too, though, I think.
Oh, not like these people. It's James Agee, this story of the southern, you know, the cotton pickers. Powerful, powerful. I don't want to go there. It's just.
Certainly don't want to work there.
What?
Yeah. Certainly don't want to work there.
What the words evoke and what they.
Yeah,
human nature is just.
Oh yeah.
Is everywhere.
Yeah.
And I like to be everywhere when I read these powerful novels, and I don't care about really the places.
Yeah.
I agree, but I still want to go to the place.
Young guy influenced by a place to go? I don't know, does Middle Earth count?
For me it does, yeah.
Yeah, well then, my answer is Middle Earth.
Well, that's the thing. You can go. You can go to all the impossible places. I'm like lots of people. I grew up with impossible places, and some of them turned out to actually really be places. But at a certain level, it's irrelevant, and at a certain level, it just overlays. And sometimes you're disappointed by the reality, or sometimes, I remember being in the Tyrol and suddenly thinking, this really reminds me of somewhere I've been before, and then thinking, oh no, it's the Lord of the Rings. That's what it really is. I've never walked here and there are no dwarves. Okay. But something about it had, in my head, in my wiring, some meaning.
We have time for one more question, if anyone has one. On the aisle there?
Yeah, I'd just like to come back to something that Alison said earlier that was very interesting to me. When she mentioned the English novelist who had written, quite rightly, a Scottish novel. And there's interesting implications to that, because I'd like to get your response to the notion that when we're looking at a national literature, say we're looking at an Australian literature or a Canadian literature, we shouldn't concern ourselves with the nationality of the author, but rather be looking at the book. Just wonder if you have any response to that idea.
Yeah, is the book itself more important than the nationality of the author?
Yeah, I mean, I think, people can, really get somewhere, and the majority opinion would be, yeah, this is a really, Lithuanian book, even though you're Swedish. And some people, there might only be 5 people who think, yes, this is deeply, deeply Lithuanian. And everybody else goes, no, it just feels Swedish to me. Some of it will just be taste, and sometimes it is, just completely irrelevant. But it's got to be that something that's coming from the realm of the imagination, where all things are possible, and that's kind of the point, and making that true is the point. And you can time travel. And I've certainly done that in a book, to go to 1939 to 1949, where I can't go, where I couldn't possibly go, and people could have turned around and said, no, I used to live there, and it wasn't like that. I think if you come to it with a generosity of spirit, though, and some kind of truth about the human condition, then it will sort of work, even though you're not from Roman Britain or wherever. But I think the impossibility of fiction gets squashed a lot now because of academics have to only look at books in a certain particular way, which is to do with the facts that they are based upon, and critics like to look at books in a particular way, which is to do with, I've met these people socially and I understand them, and if you haven't, then you really don't. And everything is about being a gatekeeper between the reader and writer. It is, of course, utterly irrelevant and stupid and ridiculous, and that didn't used to be there 100 years ago. It wasn't there. The novel, or whatever you want to call it, has survived for so long without critics and academics. It's no offence if you're a critic or an academic. The fact that you're in here means you're lovely. But I mean, it's crazy to make that intrude, and then you get all of these ways of analysing and categorising things which are to do with that mindset, rather than this is an amazing story from an amazing person and it is doing amazing things within me and we're both human beings. Do we need any more of a discussion? Really? I mean, sometimes there is because, you know, you're a Basque person writing in Basque and that's saying a lot. And, you know, somebody like Juan Perucho, him writing at all about the things that he was writing about, it was very deeply and specifically political. But and you can always put a political analysis on it just because you're saying other human beings are as interesting and complex as you inside, which is a huge thing to say politically and psychologically and emotionally. But sometimes it won't be tied up a lot with nationality. That's a long, rambling answer. I'm not even jet lagged. I have no excuse. This is how my brain works. It's terrifying.
Okay, well, I guess I want to thank all of our panelists, Liam, Alison, Beatrice, Crystal, and Irvine. Everyone, great night.